Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and Wollonjiga in the language of the Wurundjeri people. Welcome and thank you for joining us in this fourth webinar in the Resilience Matters webinar series that we have been hosting. My name is Richardson. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your host for this session. I want to start before we move on to acknowledge that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation, and also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of lands on which you might be joining us from across the nation and potentially internationally, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining and participating in this event. And also want to pay respects to and acknowledge the knowledge that's been accumulated by living with thousands of years that in this in the Australian sort of continent, and that Indigenous peoples have cared for the land. Before we get on to the main presentation, there's a few kind of housekeeping things that we need to, as we always do, kind of run through. Yeah, we'll just quickly get through that, and then we'll get on to the business. So today's event's going to be recorded and made available along with the presentation slides, and this will be available through. We'll let you know through our updates from AIDR, so keep an eye on that so you'll be able to watch it again, or we'll share it with friends and colleagues. We're going to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions in Q&A, because then we can keep an eye on them rather than in chat. They certainly get lost in there. So please do that in the Q&A feature. The good thing is you're going to be able to upload questions, so there might be ones that you think, oh, that's one I'd really love to be asked. So use that function, and certainly I'll do my best to try and get as many of those questions put to our presenter. Also encourage you, though, to use the chat window and share any thoughts that you might have or reflections. But just a reminder, you need to select everyone in the drop-down menu when you are actually putting it into the chat. And I'd also like to remind you that we want people to be respectful to each other and the presenters when they're presenting, when you're posting your comments as well. Please be aware that some of the content that we discuss may be distressing or bring up prior experiences, and certainly in that instance, please use any of the sort of techniques that you've developed to help you manage any stressful kind of reactions. So with that out of the way, I'd just like to sort of reflect on the Resilience Matters webinar series is where we sort of focus on systems, environments, and human factors that intersect to influence the various levels of risk, harm, and equity that people experience before, during, and after disaster. And so this is a series that hopefully we see, when taken as a whole, will act as a foundation for knowledge and practice in understanding disaster risk reduction. And hopefully you can apply this in the work that you're doing. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been living on and around this land mass for 60,000 plus years. I've been living with cyclones, fires, floods, storms, volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis across deep time, and this has certainly been reflected in songlines and lore and other stories. More recent times, they've also been living with disease and dispossession. So to get through this point, there's certainly there's a degree of, well, not degree, but there's massive resilience there. So So this is something that this is like the fundamentals of resilience, and it's something I think that we can certainly listen to, walk alongside as we all navigate the challenges of a changing climate and increasing disasters. But it's important for us to understand the disproportionate sort of impacts that we have seen with disasters on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and how this certainly can help us understand sort of resilience. So, with that, it's enough for me to be talking about this because I actually want to get on to the expert, and I'd love to really do love to introduce our speaker, Associate Professor Bhiamie Williamson. Bhiamie is a ULA man from northwest West Australia and with familial to West Australia. How did I get that wrong? Sorry. Northwest New South Wales. Slow down. Sorry, Bhiamie. And familial ties to northwest Queensland. I first came across Bhiamie thinking in the aftermath of Black Summer bushfires, and it was this really fabulous conversation piece that he had penned, which really kind of smacked me between the eyes and said, "Hey, we're here as well, and I think this is the first time I had certainly seen that there was this articulate kind of vision around the impacts of disasters on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people." And so, this certainly resonated with me, and we've become firm friends and sometimes co-conspirators as well and watch out when he says, "I've got an idea." But, I think this is really appropriate just to have him come along and speak about the issues of disaster resilience relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so we can learn. So enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to you, Bhiamie.
Thank you very much, John. Lovely to be with you all. And can I start just by thanking the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience for the invitation to come along and present about some research ideas. I'll get to why I said ideas and not findings in a moment, but I'm thrilled to be able to come along and have a yarn with everyone today. Next slide, thanks. I also would like to echo John's sentiments and acknowledge country. So I'm joining from the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people from Canberra. It's a really special place, a place that I'm very privileged to call home and have called home for some time. And just acknowledging the ancestors of this place and the elders who continue to carry the story and the rights and responsibilities to manage these beautiful lands and waters. Now, I will say before moving on, you'll hear a bit of background noise. When I agreed to do this webinar, I didn't realise I'd be needing to catch a plane at 3 p.m. And so I've arrived at the airport early to do the webinar. But it does mean that there's a bit of background noise, and I apologise for that. But I really hope that everyone can hear me well. And if you can't, please let me know in the chat function. And if need be, John Richardson has an invitation to come on and tell some dad jokes to get everyone further along until I can come back. So wonderful to be with you all. As John said, I'm Uali. I come from northwest New South Wales, and my mother comes from Port Curry up in northwest Queensland, and I grew up down the road from Port Curry in Mount Isa. So my family's split between Western New South Wales and Western Queensland. I live in Canberra, and I work at Monash University, which is obviously down in Melbourne. So very familiar with quite a lot of different places around the country, and I love having connections, familial and friendship connections that span Australia. So we'll kick along to the next slide. So look, when thinking about this presentation, I thought about where's a good place to start. And I think a really topical important place to start is actually with the release of the National Climate Risk Assessment Report, which came out just last week public, although it has been around for some time. just not in a public domain. But it makes for some stark reading. I thought it was a really good, important place to start because I think for the first time in a long time, it seemed that the Australian government has really, faced the risks that are presented from a warming climate through different scenarios and different modelling, and presents it in really its full scope. Parts of this report are pretty terrifying reading, but it's vitally important. I think it's one of the most important government reports to be released in the last decade. So today's presentation builds really off the back of the pretty reliable modelling, where even the most conservative estimates point to more severe, more frequent, more intense and close together disasters, fires, floods, heat waves, cyclones, and various other hazards which a warming climate will invariably induce. And we're all going to face immense challenges, whether we're Indigenous, whether we're non-Indigenous, whether we're a man, whether we're a woman, whether we're old, whether we're young, whether we own our own home or rent, whether we have a disability or not, whether we're new migrants or people who are multi-generational Australian families. Everyone has something at stake. And we'll be talking in this seminar around sort of specific examples, specific contexts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. Although I note that there are some people who are joining from Turtle Island, Yama, to our friends from up that way. And I think you'll find that there might be resonance in today's presentation with working with First Nations communities throughout the vastness that is Turtle Island. So I'll kick along. This presentation is really about ideas. So we do a lot of research, and I presented on research of our team. We present on them regularly, but today's a different tack because we're presenting on some research ideas that are emerging from our original research. So it's not necessarily findings from research, although I do reflect on the and some of the from where these I hope people enjoy being in our studies about what the problem is, how we can better understand it so we can better support communities into the future. But sticking with the climate risk assessment report for a moment, the extreme weather events will be more frequent and severe. This is certain. Annual costs will continue to balloon, and it's kind of hard to quantify. Like they do, I think, a pretty good job of trying to quantify it, but the costs are exponential. So it's really hard to have reliable, predictable modelling around the costs. But the costs are severe, and they're going to be borne by everyone. Rising sea levels already threaten low-lying island communities, particularly in the Torres Strait Islands and throughout other northern areas of Northern Australia in particular. There's a lot of remote, discrete communities stick on those islands, and holding space for the anxiety of those island communities. But it's not just those low-lying atolls and islands that are at stake. Millions of Australians live directly on the coastline or in low-lying areas like inlets and rivers and estuaries and basins. Everyone's got something at stake. And the costs will be felt both as a nation but also individually through things like insurance. Next slide. The report does a good job of beginning to explore what these future scenarios mean for the institutions that are really the bedrock of our society. Health systems will be stretched with cascading health impacts such as disease and infection. For instance, we know in the aftermath of flooding in particular, the threats of disease and infection skyrocket. So we've got really, there's already strong evidence to point to how a natural disaster leads to downstream health impacts, and this is something that will continue. Emergency services will become more overwhelmed more often. critical infrastructure such as energy, water, transport, communications are vulnerable to damage and disruption. We see this already in existing disasters, and the cost of repairing those and rebuilding them is extraordinary. And also financial impacts will be pronounced, such as I said, insurance premiums, but also food systems and other supply chains. Next slide. So the climate risk assessment report really, sets in stone what we kind of already know, that multiple disasters hitting together will strain all levels of society. Institutions will experience systemic stress. Like I said, the institutions that uphold society. And because of this, there is an urgent need for resilience planning, adaptation, coordinated response to reduce escalating impacts. Perhaps the most important thing here, and something that I said at the start, but we really need to wake up and realize that no community is vulnerable. Risks are nationwide; they are borne by everyone. East Coast to West Coast, North to South, levels of communities that were previously might have been or felt safe will grow in with feelings of being unsafe. And that insecurity and unsafeness will be felt by everyone. The question is, what do we do about it? Then click on the next prompt. So within the context of increased vulnerability for all, the ability to respond, adapt, and enjoy greater sense of security and safety are more fully enjoyed by some. And so while climate change and these disaster events will affect everyone, some people in some parts of society will be able to cope with the stress and respond more effectively than others. Next slide. This is something that we see not just within Australia, but externally. And I'm considering what these international trends look like actually provides a much easier, clearer way for us all to understand what the challenge is, I guess. So it is well established, and we can all understand really clearly that throughout the world, some nations have less ability to respond to the increasing impacts of climate change. I feel like we get discourses of this every year around November when they have the United Nations of the COP gathering. The nations who are generally talking about can be grouped together and have been grouped together, in a clumsy but illustrative way, and known as the Global South, the collection of nations from places usually places from African nation states, South Asian nation states, and parts of South America. Generally, these nations, structures within these nations are of having less access to financial resources, lower levels of administrative maturity and infrastructure to cope. Now, there are a whole range of reasons for these, and colonization is a big part of it, but I want to get to that in just a moment. But what it means is that these nations collectively generally have a lower coping threshold to respond to wildfires, floods, storms, heat waves. And also, obviously, this is a really significant issue in the Pacific region, of which Australia really needs to stand up and take responsibility and continue to lead in supporting those nation states. Because of this, systems of global climate finance have been established under the United Nations to provide financial support from wealthier, high-emitting nations to developing countries, recognizing their limited resources of vulnerability. Basically, it's an attempt to address the problem of rich, high-emitting nations creating a problem that is being borne disproportionately by global South nations. There is entrenched inequity in that, and this global system of finance has been developed to try to, as one way to address that. It is totally insufficient, but there is a recognised problem. Next slide. But just as it is widely recognised and accepted that inequality exists between nations, inequality also exists within nations. So you can apply the same mode of understanding the problem between nations to within nations, such as Australia. Next slide. And it's with that in mind, I come to the specific context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. Indigenous peoples and disasters are generally quantified, are generally understood, and you'll hear it described as Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by disasters. This is true. This is what we mean when we say that. So this is a collection of, so what we've done is we've, our team have collected information on disaster declarations made, and we limit it to the last 5 years. However, if we go further than 5 years, we'll still get like the same trends emerge. But really, over the last 5 years, these are the number of disaster declarations in each state and territory. Number of impacted LGAs, you're seeing, disaster declarations. So there's been 28 disaster declarations in Queensland, impacting 75 local government areas. Some of those disaster declarations occur over the same local government areas. So it's not just kind of like one for one, but you have local government areas being impacted again and again. The average Indigenous population is the average Indigenous population of those states and territories, so broken down by jurisdiction. However, the far right one is the average Indigenous population in local government areas impacted by disasters. So the average Indigenous population of the disaster impacted local government areas in Queensland is 28%. That is an average of 28 people out of every 100 in a disaster declared LGA in Queensland is an Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander person. We like to present it this way because this is not a problem unique to specific states and territories. It is a trend that exists right across the country. No matter which way you cut the data, whether it's by jurisdiction, whether it's by time, whether it's by hazard type or event specific, it tells the same story. There's no cutting this way, cutting the data in any way to tell a different story. There is only one story to tell, and that is in areas that are impacted and declared as disaster zones, there are going to be more Aboriginal people than generally inclusive in those states or around. So we talk about disproportionate, we're talking about the actual number of people who are exposed. Next slide. Okay. So disproportionate is used to describe the increased exposure of populations to disaster events. Indigenous people represent a higher proportion of the population. And this is something that we see unfolding with extraordinary consistency. So the language of disproportionate impacts allows us to describe the problem. However, it doesn't provide a framework for action to address it. But that's where launching into the rest of this presentation and where we go from here is trying to understand a framework, an intellectual and practice-based framework where we might be able to start to address them. But to first address the problem, we need to have an appreciation of where the problem comes from. Next slide. And the problem really does come from polarisation. So the legacies of polarisation continue to reverberate throughout modern Indigenous communities. So there are like permanent or more well-known aspects of polarisation, such as introduced disease, massacres that unfolded in frontier times, displacement from land, the removal of children. But there were other political and economic disadvantages that have lasting impact. And I think in the context of this work that we do in the emergency management, in response, and in community recovery, to having a view to understanding and appreciating these other political and economic and social dimensions of colonisation reveals important truths around where Indigenous vulnerabilities emerge from. Next slide. So most, or in some places all, Indigenous peoples for a large period of Australian history, of modern Australian history, were not allowed to work. Or those who were, such as pastoral industries throughout Northern Australia, were not paid for them. You had more than a century of indentured labour, or people who just were not able to participate in the market economy. They were not allowed to make money. Think about what that means for a whole population of people if they weren't allowed to work and accrue money and make money for more than 100 years. Indigenous peoples were largely disenfranchised, being unable to vote or stand for representative positions in Australia's parliaments. We talk about political disempowerment now, and it comes from actually not being able to participate. Australia likes to celebrate that it was one of the first places, or specifically South Australia, one of the first jurisdictions, or maybe the first jurisdiction in the world, to provide women with the vote at the time when Australia was celebrating its achievements and likes to honour its achievements for providing women the vote as if it was like a wonderful thing to celebrate, and it shouldn't have just been that way all the time. Indigenous people were still not allowed to vote for quite a long time. With the exception of returned soldiers from World War I and World War II, Indigenous peoples were not allowed to own their own home. But even returned soldiers who were allowed to provided a small, a small comfort in life, an advantage which wasn't enjoyed by, say, their brothers or sisters or other community members by purchasing their own home. Even if they owned it, they weren't allowed to transmit it to their kids. So think about what that might mean. If we're talking about, it wasn't until the 1960s and the 1970s when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were actually allowed to purchase a property and allowed to transfer that property to their kids. We talk about housing affordability, and rates of home ownership in this country. We talk about like an Indigenous problem. It's a problem that we have to deal with, but it is a problem that has been introduced throughout the years, and it has direct implications for the measurement of vulnerability. So the impacts of these economic and political disadvantages continue to have consequences for Indigenous peoples. So, next slide. So contemporary vulnerabilities in Indigenous communities, such as lack of employment, political disempowerment, lower educational attainment. I didn't even put in there that Indigenous peoples before the 1970s weren't allowed to study at Australian universities. Australia only ever got its first Indigenous graduates from university in the very early 1970s. It was only just a very select few. And so the lower rates of educational attainment is something that, again, has been introduced and forced into Indigenous communities. Political disempowerment, lower educational attainment, and lower rates of ownership have their origin in legacies of colonisation and introduced systems of disadvantages forced on Indigenous communities sustained through intergenerational inequality. So we talk about Indigenous vulnerabilities. We need to have a much greater appreciation of where those vulnerabilities come from so that we might be able to put in effective strategies and ways to address them. Like we don't have a common understanding of what the problem is. We talk about Indigenous vulnerabilities, what we mean and why they exist. We've got to not be off on a steady course. Next slide. So without an appreciation of where these vulnerabilities come from, we'll be ill-equipped and unprepared to support modern resilience building of contemporary Indigenous communities. And so in the resilience sector, the resilience building of Indigenous communities goes hand in hand. It is intractable from historical issues of justice and addressing historical inequity. Next slide. And so these are some photos of our time in the field. So here's some photos from a study that my team at AIDR and I did. So with some communities in the Riverland regions in Australia, or southern New South Wales Street community of we've got Cumragunja and also some out sort of doing some work with the flooding event with the Yorta Nations Aboriginal Corporation. It's the bottom right. I want to looking at the level of flooding for the 2022 floods in Central and Northern Victoria. So we get out into the field and we have these amazing conversations, and some of the issues that I've spoken about already really come to life in the context of work. We get out into communities and talk to communities that have been impacted. What are the unique impacts? What do they say the issues are and the challenges are? We see a lot of them emerging from this stuff that I was talking about around historical links in the organisation. Next slide. And this one is also some wonderful photos. We had a wonderful privilege. Our whole team went out and spent some time with some of the Forest Fire Management Victoria firefighters out in Western Victoria at Garrywood last week. Went out and spent a few days with them, going out about the incredible natural cathedral that is Garrywood, and talked to them about the impact of that mega fire complex out there from the desert and Garrywood over the summer. It's an extraordinary event and an extraordinary story, and just acknowledging those wonderful firefighters. I'm not sure if anyone's joining us here, but it was a real privilege. And I feel so lucky because I get to go out and I learned so much from getting out there, getting out with other Aboriginal people and talking about the work that they do and how they stand up and respond for their communities and protect the country. It's really inspirational stuff, and just, again, a lot of the stuff that we find have their origins in the things that we're talking about here today: discrimination, historical legacies, empowerment, what that looks like and how it emerges in the context of, say, an incident management team or an incident like a response, a coordinated response. Where are Indigenous values in that? Where are the Indigenous priorities? Why might they be lower or higher in different places? And the fighting for space, really. It's just an extraordinary story. So it became clear to us that the wonderful crew out there, they were fighting more than one. Next slide. And so how can we begin to organise these findings, handle these ideas into action, or at least organise them intellectually, better understand what might be done about these complex topics. During our time in the field, it's clear that these four dimensions emerge really consistently. So we've got political dimensions of response and recovery. There are social dimensions. There are economic dimensions and spiritual dimensions. And all of the incidents, anything that communities have told us has been significant during or after a major incident, can be broadly organised across or between these four dimensions. And that it's deliberately fuzzy around the side because these things don't have hard boundaries. It's like political and economic there's so many intertwined interests there, and it's better represented by kind of a fuzziness when they come together because they both influence one another. You represent these kind of larger, smaller, and different intensities. But I think the fuzzy logic is really helpful to demonstrate that we're not talking about hard line here. They all intertwine and they kind of lead into one another, So I'm going to talk about what these four dimensions mean, and then finish with how it might be useful. Next slide. So I'll begin with political. What do I mean when I talk about political? Indigenous communities, before Europeans got here, Indigenous communities were organised into body politics. You had distinct communities, whether organised by language, by specific groups, by region, by key networks. There were political communities that operated, and we've seen colonisation really come in and smash those political communities, and you see this kind of reforming of political identity in modern time. There's internal politics within Indigenous communities, but also there's politics that Indigenous communities have to navigate within their wider region as well. Laws change in response to the prevailing political winds at times. So laws, we think about laws being set in stone. Laws are they are set, but laws do change. The concept and the operation of politics doesn't. There are political imperatives to be seen in the resilience building of all countries. I've been at the high risk level summit here in Canberra, and they talk about the political imperative to act at a federal level. They provide the mandate for the federal government to sometimes to not be seen to be intervening, but always to be seen as supporting. And I guess the final one is that Indigenous communities and representing organisations actually have sizable political capital in Australia today, and it's about how they use it and when. And for what purpose? So political really is a way to describe the various political dimensions that operate and influence, the broad resilience spectrum. Next slide. So the next one is economic. Indigenous communities, before Europeans arrived, Indigenous communities did have economic systems. There were trade systems, there were land-based economies, operated in, and there were international economies as well, because you of course had Macassan traders who would sail to northern parts of Australia and trade with various Aboriginal groups in northern parts of Australia, and they would sail home on the monsoon winds to some of the islands in the archipelago of Indonesia. So there are economic considerations. Understanding the Indigenous peoples have been made for because of colonisation. Economic imperatives also talk about, seeking out opportunities and for large-scale investment of community resilience. Like broadly, resilience and emergency management in Australia, as it is anywhere, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And we see Indigenous people and Indigenous organisations really being cut out of that industry. And this is something that we all really need to change. And one of the ways to do that is to have a mind and utilise periods of repair, recovery and reconstruction to address historically weakness empowerment. Where are Aboriginal interests and how are they embedded within broader recovery efforts? Where's the money going, and is it going to some places and not others? Good questions to ask, and always good to be mindful of. And investing in the community control sector, building adaptable resilient workforces for the future. These are all economic imperatives. It's a way to understand the specific dimensions, economic dimensions that really drive this large pie of Indigenous resilience building today. Next slide. There are social dimensions to this, so respecting the safety of Indigenous communities, autonomous networks, and also how the social networks of Indigenous communities are inherently tied to the land as well. Connection with country, caring for country, it promotes social harmony. So you've got environmental restoration really intersecting very strongly with social cohesion. But also understanding that the processes of colonisation have really caused, in a large sense, in many places, the social disintegration of modern communities because of the depravities of colonisation. And then Indigenous communities continue to be in a state of recovery and repair because of that. They'll talk about intergenerational challenges. This is like hundreds of years worth of challenges that we continue to be on the road to. Responding with respect to social challenges is really important. Acknowledging the broad social context of a lot of Indigenous communities, the social relationships between them and non-Indigenous Australians, whilst also having in mind to respect the strengths that are really inherent in modern Indigenous communities. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't a sense of resilience, latent resilience already there, if colonisation hadn't activated a certain strength. Really understanding that and having a view to make sure that's central and part of all of our efforts to engage in. And really seeking to, through all of our work, reinforcing social systems by not applying additional pressure through policies, laws, and opportunities. It's about creating inclusive practice that builds resilience in the broadest possible sense. And it really creates programs, creates funding opportunities, and creates policies and strategies and practice that brings communities together. Next slide. Bear with me, guys. Sorry, my apologies. And spiritual, when there is a really deep spiritual context in Indigenous communities that goes right back to creation. And, the spiritual well-being of many is inherently tied to country and spirituality of communities that they go together. So a sense of Indigenous communities were a sold to the spiritual basis of that all groups, desecration of land, including pro-nation stuff through against, contributes to the spiritual degradation. That this is degradations, introduces, this is degradation of the land, introduces the degradation on the spiritual basis for life. And so does land restitution and care of the country repair that basis for life. And we need to we need to recognize and be around and comprehend that there is an inherent spiritual resilience in these are the rare to start talking about that and supporting resilience, planning, and recovery efforts. Next slide, please. And so this is what's really meant about these four dimensions or pillars of Indigenous resilience. And I think it provides a framework to better understand the problem and better understanding the problem that equips us to better address the challenges. Next slide. And so kind of exploring these four areas is really neat, but talking about them in very familiar language around cultural determinants of Indigenous resilience. They represent an intellectual framework to understand what might be done to enhance resilience and also, act as distinct sites of recovery. Next slide. Thanks for your patience, everyone. And we provided everyone an opportunity to read that slide. And it is a busy day at the airport. I was in a non-busy spot. So really trying to understand that resilience practitioners, that we all can act as agents of change to support the future resilience building of communities in a way that addresses historical injustices. It's a powerful place to be in, and I think that the more we should all realise the potential for all of us to now make a genuine difference, not just in the life of communities today, but in historical timelines of colonisation, disempowerment. We can all be agents of change, and that's a really powerful thing to understand. Next slide. So what are we talking about today? Bit of a recap. Start with the Australian Climate Risk Assessment report. Yeah, we're in trouble. So there's inequity within nations, better placing Indigenous vulnerabilities within the context of colonisation. I introduced 4 pillars of Indigenous resilience, being political, economic, social, and spiritual, and spoke about them, tried to tie them off as being these cultural determinants of Indigenous resilience. And just appreciating that resilience recovery. Was sites. Next slide. And if you're interested in the work that we do, you can follow us on LinkedIn. We also hold and administer a community of ambassadors quarterly online. It is available to anyone in the sector who's interested in this stuff, wants to know more, and wants to connect with like-minded people. You're welcome to shoot us an email, and we'll add you to that community of practice. And I'll leave it there. My good friend John is back with us, and I would love to answer some questions.
Thanks, Bhiamie, and thanks for navigating the airport and and the flights to wherever they were going to. That was no mean feat, but fabulous. Fantastic reflection and observations, as you say, from the work that you're doing, and I think it just comes back to context is the key. Understanding context. How many times do we talk about understanding context? And quite often, I think in emergency management, disaster risk reduction, we haven't done that over the years. We sort of just kind of barrel in with this kind of one size fits all, and not necessarily understanding the context in which people are living and the challenge and the stresses and that have been placed on them from a whole bunch of external factors. And so stuff that I've kind of worked on about a decade ago around sort of trying to understand resilience from a strengths and capacities approach was that sort of thing of, people have got good health and well-being, they're secure, with economic security and sort of physical safety and, good knowledge and connection, and obviously connection to each other, but place and land and country, then that helps build resilience. And you can see the story that you described there is you can see where that sort of idea of resilience is under pressure because of these range of, because of colonisation, because of what we did, and so I think that's helping us understand, getting us to a point where we can start having conversations about, well, what comes next? How do we do this? How do we work together? How do we do this? So I think it's fabulous. And I think the other thing, reflection, before get to the questions, and please start giving us there's a few there. I like the way that you've called out the political dimension, because the political dimension is not part of the discourse in disasters in Australia. It's kind of sort of, other than we all get annoyed by politicians turning up, sort of thing. But actually thinking about the political nature of the decisions that need to be made, and governance, and how important governance is in everything that we do. So look, that's kind of a couple of reflections on what you had to say, and it's most confronting. I think that's the other thing, and we need to be confronted. I know a lot of people don't want to be confronted, but like I said at the intro, that first piece that you wrote, that in the conversation that I read, which really did kind of smack me between the eyes, I went, I got to feel uncomfortable about this. And it helps me sort of think, all right, well, how can we do better? So, up for some questions. Oh, I can't see you. There we go. The questions took over everything. So Leighton's asked us, it's the thing about disproportionate impacts. Do you have a sense of where there's intersectionality with other groups? So people like living with disability and other groups. Do you have a sense of that in your research?
We have a sense of it. We don't. It's not as comprehensively covered as say the just the pure sort of demography of the Indigenous population. But we can also, and something we'd like to sort of talk about and draw attention to, is the really useful profile of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. It's got a really unique and distinct population profile, where more than half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are under the age of 23 years of age. What that means, expecting in the future, is they've got a young, youthful, fertile population growing up, becoming the exposures and the disproportionality will increase, and exponentially so. More Indigenous people having more families, more kids, growing up. So we do a bit of stuff targeted particularly on the unique circumstances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and kids and young people. But like, what I guess for us, it's important for us to do that, to highlight that this is a trend that isn't going to continue and it's going to exacerbate, it's going to become worse. And within that, there are other social, determinants of health, like overcrowded housing, chronic health conditions, encounters with law enforcement agencies and incarceration and whatnot. All of those things will also increase. We don't need to map it to know that it is going to happen, and it is already happening. So I guess, I don't have a full-time demographer in my team, but if I did, I know exactly what it is.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Belinda's asked, and I think this is a great question because it actually leaks us into practice. So have you seen good case studies of partnerships between emergency services and Indigenous communities particularly around flood?
Yeah, good question. When we did our study looking at the 2022-2023 floods in Victoria, Southern New South Wales and South Australia, there was only one community that said they had a positive experience in the recovery effort, in the recovery phase after those floods receded. And that community was the guy that I visited and showed some photos of, the guys from River Murray and Mallee Aboriginal Corporation. And they're a wonderful group and really powerful, staunch community, really amazing ranger group who are really on the front lines with this stuff. They had a really positive experience in the recovery, working with government agencies. And the reason for that is because they had working relationships with all of those government agencies before the flood hit. The government, and the thing about it is, like, our max officers are right in the middle of town, and all of the government agencies and staff travel to their offices and meet them there. And in the time that I spent with them there, you could see it. There were, government officers, people from fisheries, people from parks, people from, the emergency services, people from other kind of government agencies, the South Australian government, coming to their offices because they had those established relationships in the recovery, not necessarily the response. There was other stuff going on in the response, but in the recovery, they were an indelible part of it, and they had a really wonderful experience working with all the government agencies. It was actually really, harmonious, really, for the region, and really empowering for that range group and that native title group. So yes, I've seen good practice. And if you want to know something that I would say is exceptional practice, gold standard, we are having a national gathering at Gunai Kurnai Lands and Waters Aboriginal Corporation next May. If you sign up to our mailing list and keep an eye on our LinkedIn, you'll get information and updates on that. The reason why I point that out in this context is we are taking it there because an extraordinary collaboration took place post bushfires around Lakes Entrance with the Gunai Kurnai Lands and Waters Aboriginal Corporation that really highlights what's possible, particularly around the rebuilding of the built environment. And we are taking people there to tell that story in situ. People can see it, people can feel it, people can smell it, people can take photos of it. So look out for that and please come along.
Fantastic. Looking forward to that gathering. I think it's going to be extraordinary. I guess extending this theme further, right? Rebecca's question is around how to engage with young Indigenous people on these issues, because there's a justifiable reason to be suspicious and disengage with, authority, which obviously disaster management's part of.
Yeah. I think like with Indigenous kids, it's the same with any kids. If you go in and talk to them about what they care about and talk to them about a future and something they've got a stake in, they'll want to talk to you.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I'm not convinced that most Australian government and resilience agencies engage well with kids at all. And I think that there are ways to engage sensitively and effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids and young people. And I think in a lot of respects we do that better than non-Indigenous Australians. But I think so like there are ways to do it, but it also so place specific as well.
Yeah. Okay. I reckon we might have time for one or possibly two. Ifty's question: are we in a post-colonisation stage, or is colonisation still ongoing?
Yeah, so I never feared this. I was talking at home, one of my uncles, and the thing post-colonial came up, and he's like, looked at me, like kind of stuck his head around. And he's like, what have they left? and
Yep.
and no, so we're not post-colonial, and
Yes.
we'll never be post-colonial.
Yep.
But I think understanding that colonization, it is both an event, but it's a process. So it occurred like on a date, and that date changed in different areas of Australia. However, the system of colonization, really, like understanding it as a system of introduced advantages. It's a system of ascendancy. Some groups in society will enjoy it at different periods, and other groups in society will not. So it's a system of advantage and ascendancy that upholds certain groups, and certain groups like to guard that ascendancy and that advantage quite jealously. But whilst there is that system of ascendancy and advantage, none of us can honestly say that colonization has ceased.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, not great, but thank you for that answer. Not great. That's great. We're still here. No, sorry about that. That wasn't meant to be that way. Right. I think I'd love to ask you a bunch of these other questions, but can you give me a 1 minute answer? How do you apply the framework that you've? This is paraphrasing a couple of questions. How do you apply framework in practice? Which way would you look at that?
I'd start by looking at grant funding, and these are criteria that you could measure grant funding applications and also acquitting grants. And they're also provide an assessment to assess grant applications. So if you want to change anything, go straight for the money first. So I think grant funding, this is something that can be written into funding guidelines.
Yep. Fantastic. That is always a way, I think, to really just start changing things. I think that's all we have time for, as much as I would love to keep talking about this. And I know that somebody has said, is there a possibility of doing more in this space? So this is something that I think, Bhiamie, you and I will talk about this at some stage when we put our co-conspirator hats on.
It's scheming, may continue.
Yes, there's been a bit of that. But look, I do want to thank you for your time and fitting us in, and also being able to do it at the airport. I want to thank everyone for coming along and giving up your time to hear us. We do appreciate everyone is busy, and there's often competing demands, but this is important. This work that we all do is really important, and the better we understand the complexity of it, it's going to make us navigating these challenges way easier. So also want to thank my colleagues Ange Draper and Charlotte Fell for their work on making this webinar possible in the background on the decks. I want to acknowledge the National Indigenous Disaster Resilience Initiative. I think this is an extraordinary initiative, well overdue, but is kicking some extraordinary goals. So acknowledge who you lead, Bhiamie, and the support that they have of us in AIDR. Also acknowledging the financial support of the National Emergency Management Agency that allows us to do what we do. Our next webinar will be showcasing the 24-25 major incidents report. That'll be on Wednesday, October the 1st from 1 to 2:30 p.m. There'll be a registration link in the chat. The next webinar in this Resilience Matters series will be on Wednesday, the 12th of November, and that will we're finalising that. That's likely to be looking at social equity. So when you leave the call, you'll be taken to a short survey, and please fill it out. We use this information to help make sure that we're meeting your needs. It's certainly been my pleasure, as it always is, to host this webinar. And until next time, please stay well. Thank you for coming along today.